Okay, so on to congressional elections then. And we talked about the different things that Congress is supposed to do. All legislatures in modern democracies, but Congress in particular, things like legislate, but also check. All that, to a large extent, comes back to that notion of representation, right? Congress is supposed to write laws that in one way or another, we saw it's not as simple as writing the laws or voting on them exactly as their voters or their constituents would, but it's certainly supposed to be in the interest of their voters or constituents. It's supposed to be in some way good for them, okay? And how do you make sure that that's happening? Through elections, right? If people don't like the way that their senator or their representative is voting, if they don't like the laws that are coming out of Congress, they can vote for somebody different. That's the whole point of those congressional elections. We saw when we talked about the Federalist Papers, the reason that the House of Representatives is elected every 2 years to make sure that they always have to keep in mind what the people want. Okay, but when we look at congressional elections, what we find is that incumbents tend to win, the people already in office. Okay, so first of all, what is an incumbent? An incumbent is the person who is already in office. So right now, or in 2024, if Joe Biden runs for re-election, he will be the incumbent president. But that goes for any office. Okay, so the incumbent is the person who is already in office. Sometimes you use it just to refer to the person when they're in office. Oftentimes you use it in the context of elections, okay? And when we look at congressional elections, the incumbent, the person who is running, who is already in office and who is running for re-election, they win an overwhelming amount of the time, okay? They win roughly 96% of the time, okay? This goes back to, say, the mid-60s when this really becomes very dramatic, okay? And there's a good chart in your book that shows some of this. So overall, they win 96% of the time. Even in 1994, that kind of big watershed when the Republicans won control of the House for the first time in decades, 92% of the incumbent senators, 89% of the incumbent representatives won re-election. 2010, another time when the Congress changed hands, it was 87% re-election rate in the House, 90% re-election rate in the Senate, okay? So even in situations where enough people are losing that the party with the majority changes, the vast majority of incumbents are still being reelected, okay, in both the House of Representatives and the Senate. This can be just a tiny bit misleading, because sometimes if an incumbent knows that they're going to lose or feels strongly that they might lose, they might retire. They might just not run for re-election, but that's pretty rare. It's not like that's happening a lot of the time. Every once in a while it might. But for the most part, incumbents are winning, again, 96% of the time, all right? Even if we lowball and say 85%, and it's far more than that, 85% of the time the incumbent is winning, okay? So that's pretty remarkable. And obviously you're not getting the kind of, well, we'll talk about that. You kind of are getting turnover. But despite the fact, the idea that people are supposed to be running for re-election, people are voting for who they want, they keep voting in these incumbents, okay? And there are a few odd things about that. Okay, most incumbents also win with more than 60% of the vote, okay? So they tend to win, not only do they win 96% of the time, they usually win with more than 60% of the vote. And that may not sound like that much, I mean, it's not 90%, but in a two-party system, 60% is actually a really high margin, okay? So not only are they winning almost always, they're usually winning by really large margins, okay? So these are not at all competitive elections, okay? And what happens, again, one of the paradoxical things here is that people often complain about Congress. Now, I mean, recently especially, Congress has had historically low approval ratings. Most people are very unhappy with Congress. And yet, in recent elections, this incumbent advantage is as clear as ever. You're still getting incumbents being reelected 90-some% of the time, okay? And usually by very large margins, okay? So people say, time to vote these clowns out of Congress. I'm tired of this, new people. But the incumbent advantage means that the incumbents keep getting reelected, okay? What's going on? I mean, a few other points about this, okay? Senators win re-election slightly less often by slightly narrower margins, okay? And that's because, as we've talked about, the Senate is often considered to be a more attractive or a more desirable position, okay? Longer terms, a higher national profile, more prestige, more power. So the Senate often, even if you're an incumbent, you might face a more significant or more not capable, because it's not that people aren't capable, but a more high profile challenger, okay? So maybe a former governor who is very popular in the state, or someone who is a rising star in a political party, or somebody with a impressive military background. Senators sometimes have more challenging challengers. Okay, so the incumbent advantage is a little bit less pronounced with the Senate, but again, still very strong. Still, the vast majority of senators are being reelected when they of incumbent senators when they run for reelection are being reelected. Okay, evidence shows that even when the challenger's views are closer to those of the voters, the incumbent still wins. So even when the challenger, the person trying to beat the incumbent and become the newly elected, even when the challenger's views are closer to those of the voters, if you look at what the incumbent has said, how they voted, and you look at the opinions of the voters, the challenger's views actually seem to be closer to what the voters want than what the incumbent has said or done. Still, the incumbents win. Okay. Now, despite all of this, incumbents usually feel insecure, anxious about reelection. Okay. There is Hide the Pain Harold, as a representative especially, wins his election, immediately has to start thinking about campaigning again. Remember, that's by design. We saw that in the Federalist Papers. That is the design. Have those, especially in the House of Representatives, have them constantly thinking about the next election, and therefore constantly attuned to the moods, the desires, the needs, the interests, but also even just kind of almost like the emotional outlook of the people, so they can respond to them. Okay. So what happens, though, as political scientists have studied this, is that sometimes you get a situation where people run for Congress with somewhat big ideas about legislation, about what they want to do, but when they get elected, they realize that they almost immediately have to start worrying about reelection. So they become much more focused on being reelected than they necessarily are on carrying out these great legislative ideas that they have. The other thing is, of course, special interests, lobbyists, political action committees, people who are going to fund their reelection tend to have a lot of influence then, because they're already thinking about that campaigning again, already thinking about that next election. To a large extent, what that means in practice is they're already thinking about fundraising and worrying about that, okay? So despite the fact that this incumbent advantage exists, actual people in Congress tend to be very insecure, very anxious about getting reelected, and very much focused on that next election. And again, this is especially true in the House of Representatives, where, again, they're sworn in January. It's already less than 2 years before their next election, okay? Why does this happen? Why do people have such a poor opinion of Congress and yet keep electing? The only thing they have control over in terms of Congress, of the composition of Congress, is their own representative, their own senator. If they're so unhappy with Congress, as many public opinion polls have shown that they are, why do they keep re-electing the same people? Because what turns out is that these same public opinion polls, or similar ones, show they tend to like their representative. They dislike Congress. They have a low opinion of what Congress is doing, but they tend to like their representative, their incumbent, basically, and think that that person is doing a good job, okay? Some of that is because well, why is that? Let's take a look. What is the cause of the incumbent advantage? Why are incumbents so successful, okay? Now, ideally, you might think voters know their policy positions and they agree with them, but in fact, there is very little evidence of that. In fact, there's a lot of evidence that voters don't really know how their incumbents have voted on, even on important questions, okay? This thing in the PowerPoints gives an example of that, but there's various evidence that shows, or that suggests, and more or less gives fairly strong evidence that people do not necessarily have a great idea of how their incumbents are voting. They may have some sense of what their general outlook is, but they're not good at saying this is what this person did, or this is why they voted this way, or this is how they voted, okay? So there's not much evidence that when voters re-elect their incumbents, that they are basing that on specific votes or specific policy positions that they've taken, okay? A popular theory you see a lot talked about in the media, it's dramatic, the notion of presidential coattails. Okay, that's a phrase you might hear discussed in the media around election time. And the notion there is, it's like the president, coattails, the idea is that you're riding someone else's success. So it's like in the old days when men would wear coats that had long tails, it's like you're sitting on their tails that drag on the floor and they're pulling you along, okay? People like that. They like the idea the president gets so much more attention. They like the idea that the president is somehow leading to these elections in Congress. But the reality is that almost all members of Congress who are reelected win by a larger margin than the president does, okay? So obviously the president isn't helping members of the other party, but even within the president's own party, almost all members of Congress who are reelected are winning by a larger margin than the president does, okay? So they're winning more comfortably. They're beating their opponent by a larger margin than the president beats eventually her opponent, okay? So there, every once in a while that may happen in a battleground state, very close Senate election. Maybe people go out to vote for a particular president, and then they also vote for that president's, the candidate from that president's party. But the vast majority of cases, that's not what's happening. When we're looking at the incumbent advantage, we're trying to understand what it is. It's not presidential coattails. Okay, they are winning very easily they're winning more comfortably than the president is. Okay, there's no evidence that congressional elections are swayed by the economy. American voters often tend to attribute the economy to the president. If it's going well, the president benefits. If it's going poorly, the president can suffer in elections. No evidence that Americans do that with Congress, that they tend to, attribute anything to Congress in terms of the economy. So again, if you went back to the 1960s, when the incumbent advantage begins to be really pronounced, and it continues through that time, most of that time has been economic growth for the United States, okay? But there's no evidence that that's what people are voting on, okay? So what is it? What makes incumbents so special? What makes them so successful? Okay, first of all, free advertising, okay? They are very visible in their own district. They are newsworthy, right? When they show up, they are already a sitting senator or representative. If they might make an important speech, or they may just come back to their district to speak at a high school graduation, or to open a hospital, or to do whatever, to do some sort of more or less obvious PR event, but it gets covered because, again, they are already important, okay? You've heard them before, you've heard of them. There's a lot of evidence that when people go in to vote, they don't want to vote for somebody they've never heard of. So just simply knowing the name of their incumbent helps, okay? So, and of course, they get a lot of free advertising because, again, they are newsworthy public figures, right? They are the actual representative or the actual senator of that area, okay? They're also, as incumbents, they're also more likely to know the voters' concerns, okay? The voters will contact them directly, obviously, and say, I'm really opposed to this. To get a good read, so there are two things there. One, to get a good read on public opinion, good public opinion polls tend to be fairly expensive, okay? And so they get some of that information for free. The challenger will have to pay to do a public opinion poll to find out what voters might think on particular issues. And the other thing is, what's really important is what motivates voters. So if you take the time to write or to call your representative or your senator, you probably care a lot about that issue, okay? A public opinion poll, it may turn out that 60% of the people want one thing, but none of them care enough to actually contact their representative about that. None of them are actually going to vote on that issue. So knowing that, if you've gotten 2,000 calls about a particular issue and 85% of them are saying one thing, it doesn't necessarily make a lot of difference what the rest of the district or the rest of the state thinks. The people who are motivated on that particular issue think one way, okay? Those are the people who really care. At least there's some evidence that those are the people who really care. Maybe they've written you off and they're not going to bother to contact you. But the fact that they're contacting you and they're motivated to do that is a good sign that they're going to be motivated to vote, and that they're going to be motivated to vote on this issue. So knowing that people are contacting you is in some ways much better information than just having a public opinion poll saying, this is what people think, but who knows how much they really care? Who knows if they actually care enough about these opinions to vote this way, okay? So advertising, knowing voters' concerns, claiming credit is the other big thing. This is very uncontroversial, okay? Policy positions are always going to lose you votes, okay? Take where we are, Southwest Oklahoma. Gun control tends to be pretty unpopular. Most people oppose gun control, but there are some people here who want more gun control. So when our representative or when a senator votes against gun control, when people know that, they are going to lose some votes. They're going to win a lot more. They're probably going to get a lot more support than they are opposition, and they're probably going to secure more votes than they're going to lose, but they will lose some. So policy positions are always controversial, and of course on more narrow questions where public opinion is much more divided in this area, it's going to be even harder, right? It's going to be even riskier. to take a particular policy position, which of course, as a member of Congress, they may eventually have to do by voting on something. But claiming credit when you say, hey, I did this great thing that benefited you, that's really uncontroversial. Most people don't mind that. Okay, they can do that through casework. You might contact your representative or your senator to help you with some issue involving the government. Okay, and then you, even if they couldn't help you, even if you don't ultimately get what you wanted, you come away with a good experience and good associations with them. And then pork barrel, that's basically government spending. Okay, they get money funding for the district, for the state, for highways, for military bases, for schools, for hospitals, for all kinds of things, job creation, all these things. And that's one of the reasons why Congress is sometimes unpopular nationally, but your incumbent, you like your own incumbent, because you dislike the idea that Congress is handing out all this money to other places where you don't live, but you like the idea that your incumbent is getting that for you. Okay, so pork barrel, that's a term that basically means government spending. It's a somewhat cynical or dismissive term. And there have been some famous cases like the bridge to nowhere in Alaska that didn't really seem to be necessary. But of course, a lot of that government spending does a lot of good. And when the representative or when the senator can come back and say, hey, I helped secure this. I helped, when we did the base realignment commission, I helped make sure that Oklahoma, did not suffer from that. All of our military bases expanded. None of them shrunk. None of them closed. A lot of states weren't so lucky. That tends to be much more popular with people than specific policy positions. So when you can claim credit for that, that is something that voters like, okay? So free advertising, they've heard of you before, there's a perceived benefit of experience, okay? They're more likely to know what voters really care about because you're contacting them because they're already in office. And then they can claim credit. They can claim credit casework, but more broadly, because not everybody contacts people, obviously, to get help with whatever. So they may not do casework for most constituents or most voters, but then claiming credit for helping the state, the district through securing government funding of some sort or another, okay? Those two things are very popular and tend to really help incumbents, okay? Sooner or later, they do have to vote. They have to take policy positions, okay? Other things that help incumbents, safe seats, okay? Right here in our district, right? It's going to be a strongly Republican district. Eventually, Tom Cole will retire, and there will be an open primary. But once that Republican is in, they will likely be reelected, okay? So a safe seat here refers to the actual office, right? The idea is it's a seat in Congress. These safe seats, many districts, many states are relatively secure for one party or the other. So once you're elected, until there's some sort of massive sea change in your district or in your state regarding party identification and which party voters tend to prefer, you're probably going to keep being reelected just because of your R or your D after your name. Whatever party you're affiliated with, you're probably, that's going to help you a lot, okay? And that's a big part of what, again, many districts are like this district, where they are very strong for one party or the other. And once you're elected, all of these other things, advertising, claiming credit, but also the party affiliation helps a lot, okay? You often have a weak opponent. Again, this is less true in Senate races because the Senate is considered a bigger prize, so it may draw better people. And I don't say better people like there's anything wrong with challengers in elections to the House of Representatives, but more well-known, more people who are more likely to garner or win more votes, okay? Another major advantage that incumbents have is money. Okay, we just said one of the major advantages they have is name recognition. People have heard of them. Obviously, you can pay for name recognition. You can buy advertising. If you can buy enough advertising and get your name out there enough, people will start to have heard of you. And the maybe kind of low information voter, when they get into the voting booth, instead of saying, I've heard of this person, I've never heard of this other person, they might say, well, I've heard of both of these people. Or maybe I've even heard of the challenger more than I've heard of the incumbent, okay? But the challengers have to pay for that through advertising, okay? Incumbents, again, already have name recognition. The best thing that a challenger can do to make themselves more competitive, to make their election more competitive, is to spend a lot of money on advertising so that, again, people know who they are. People know who they are. They recognize the name, okay? However, incumbents tend to outspend challengers quite a bit, okay? And part of this is because a lot of that money, again, comes from interest groups. And they know just as well as we do that incumbents tend to win re-elections. So if you are an interest group who is lobbying for a particular industry or a particular policy outcome, and you have money to spend on election to influence the member of Congress that you're going to spend money on, obviously the safe bet is to give it to the incumbent, right? Because you know that they're probably going to win anyways. So if you want to spend money on somebody's campaign and be in a situation where they sort of owe you a favor once they're elected, obviously it makes much more sense to give it to the incumbent when you know that they're probably going to be reelected, okay? So this is going back a way. In 2004, incumbents outspent challengers by an average ratio of 15 to 1, okay? So for every $1 spent by the challenger, the incumbent spent 15. That's an average, okay? And again, that's 2004. That's a little while ago now. 2012, it was a 3 to 1 ratio, but over a third of challengers spent $25,000 or less, okay? So they spent basically the bare minimum that you would need to spend to run a congressional campaign. In 2014, Senate incumbents outspent challengers roughly 10 to 1, okay? One of the things that is starting to happen is that some of these congressional races are becoming more national. And and again, not even becoming, this has happened for a little while now. So in 2004, it was still relatively rare for people to give money on the internet to political candidates. By 2016 or 2020, it's more common, so it can happen that people will give money to a person running for the Senate or the House of Representatives even in a place that they don't live, either because they're really committed to a particular political outlook, or maybe they live in a state or a district that isn't competitive. So if they really want the Republicans or the Democrats to win a majority and to be able to carry out certain policy goals, it may be a waste for them to give money to, if they're committed enough that they're willing to give money. It might be a waste for them to spend money in their state, so they might spend it somewhere else. Okay, so this massive advantage of incumbents versus challengers is going down somewhat. But again, in many cases, again, in our district here in Southwest Oklahoma, there's none of that. The challenger tends to run a very shoestring operation. There's not much spending at all, okay? Again, one party dominates in a given district, okay? Why would anyone run against an incumbent? Because they're a fool. Not entirely fair. A previous textbook we used talked about how people are sometimes, because you always, just in case there's a scandal, you always want to run somebody in an election. You never want to have an uncontested election just in case some unbelievable scandal breaks about the incumbent at the last minute. But often then the people who are put into the position of running against them, they don't always understand how unlikely it is for them to win. They're not fools. It's, again, it was a whole joke that I did based on a previous textbook. We don't need to worry about that now. Okay. So people, as a result of the incumbent advantage and knowing that some of these members of Congress are there for 30 or more years, or even 10 or 15 years, some people have proposed congressional term limits, okay? We obviously have term limits for the presidency as a result of an amendment after FDR, Franklin Roosevelt, was elected 4 times. Originally in the Constitution, the president could run as many times as they wanted. Okay, George Washington, of course, was elected once. He ran for re-election. After that, he stepped down, and he sort of set a standard or an expectation then that the most that any president would run is for 2 terms. Again, Franklin Roosevelt, Great Depression, World War II, he was elected 4 times. After that, they amended the Constitution to say the president can only be elected twice, but Congress also, in the Constitution, there are no term limits, okay? So you could not pass a law. Of course, Congress would have to pass the law, but you cannot just pass a law introducing congressional term limits. You would have to amend the Constitution, extremely unlikely to happen. Again, you would need 2/3 of each House of Congress to propose that amendment. And again, the Congress is unlikely to do that. But again, we also know just generally amending the Constitution is very difficult, okay? But even apart from that, okay, the argument against term limits is that you lose experienced legislators, okay? And oftentimes, actually, again, when political scientists go in and they research the effects of term limits, what they find is not that it gives you lots of great new ideas and it produces better legislation. It's actually the opposite. You have a lot of inexperienced legislators who are easily manipulated or, let's say, influenced by lobbyists, okay? Think about when you start a new job, right? You don't really know what you're doing. All kinds of people will give you advice and you'll follow it. It's the same basic idea with legislators. They don't know. They don't know what's going on. So if the longest institutional memory and the longest experience anyone has is 8 years, that's not actually very much, okay? And 8 years is not necessarily that much time to really learn something as complex as government and legislation and policy can be, okay? So first of all, losing experienced legislators, obviously you lose good as well as bad legislators that way, but you lose experienced legislators, and the overall effect is not more democracy and better legislation. The overall effect is more influence for lobbyists and interest groups. Of course, you also, the argument is, well, we have term limits. They're elections. We have 2-year term limits in the House of Representatives, 6-year term limits in the Senate. If people want to keep voting for these people for their incumbent, then that's democracy. We should let them. We should let that go. Okay, the final argument against term limits is that there's fairly high turnover in Congress anyways. We may often see you may see some of these senators who have been there for 30 years or more, or representatives who have been there for 20 or 30 years, and you might think, oh, that's common, but it's really not, okay? This information, I don't have it for the 117th Congress yet. I always get this from the official report that they release. They haven't done it for that for the new Congress that was just sworn in January yet. I haven't seen the report. But the past 4 Congresses, so every 2 years you get a new set of members of Congress sworn in. Past 4 Congresses, so this is going back to 2013, you see a pretty consistent pattern. Representatives and senators both have an average of about 10 years of service, okay? So one way or another, either there's more turnover, than we think, or they move on to something else, or they retire for whatever reason. But the average, and obviously some of these people have been in there very long, but the average is about 10 years of service, okay? So the average is not 25 years. Most people are not staying there for 2 or 3 decades. Plenty of people are leaving much sooner, and the average length of service is 10 years or even less in the House. Not huge, 8.6 years in the 116th Congress, but there's already a fair amount of turnover. Despite some of these really dramatic counterexamples, there's already a fair amount of turnover, okay? And that's another argument that people make against term limits, is that, first of all, they're not going to happen because the Constitution is clear and you would have to amend, which is almost certainly not going to happen. You would lose good legislators as well as bad. People should be able to vote. If they don't like, or if they have bad representatives, they should vote them out, and they should be able to do that. Maybe most importantly, you end up giving more power to lobbyists and special interest groups. And then finally, there's already a fair amount of turnover. So you don't necessarily need term limits to get rid of people. Plenty of people, one way or another, are leaving Congress much sooner than 20 or 30 years.